of the afternoon before the evening working groups. So we are here to talk about broadband now. So during the pandemic, broadband has become more important than ever, and the policy debates over it deeper and probably more consequential. It's allowed many of us to continue working and going to school, and the lack of it has caused others to fall further behind. So now we've got new programs and more money coming online. How do we spend it? What should we focus on? How do we prioritize? Those are the questions. And we have a great panel of speakers. Here I'll introduce them very quickly, and then we'll go to questions. So first, we have Michelle Connolly, who is professor of the practice in the economics department at Duke University. Her research and teaching focuses on telecommunications policy, media policy, education, growth, and development. And she also served as chief economist at the FCC. We have Donald Cravins, who is executive vice president and chief operating officer of the National Urban League. Prior to joining the National Urban League, he served as vice president of policy and external affairs at Charter Communications. He's also been chief of staff for U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana and a member of the Louisiana State Legislature. And to my left, we have Dominique Harrison. Dr. Harrison is the director of the Technology Policy Program at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. She focuses on platform accountability, broadband access and adoption, and privacy and algorithmic fairness. Before her current role, she served as project director in the Aspen digital program at the Aspen Institute. And to her left is Greg Rosston, who is director of the public policy program at Stanford University, the Gordon Cain Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and professor of economics by courtesy. He served as deputy chief economist at the FCC, working on the implementation of the Telecom Act of '96, and helped to design and implement the first spectrum auctions in the US. So before we go to things, we'll go to some of our, the substantive debate points. The title of the panel is How Do We Spend $100 Billion on Broadband? But right now I don't really have any idea how much the amount of money is we're talking about. Once we take what's in the infrastructure bill and the EBB and sort of all these various efforts, I mean, does anybody know kind of what the magnitude is we're currently talking about? Anybody can take this.
I just know that recently you said $65 billion on the infrastructure bill, but I don't know how much EEB is.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that a large part of the funding should be going toward the continuance of the EBB program. We know that low-income consumers cannot afford to be online, and so we need an internet subsidy program that can allow these folks to afford to be online. And the current Lifeline program, as we all know, is outdated in terms of the amount of money that goes to consumers, and so we need a larger amount that can be given to low-income families to be able to afford broadband services. I would also say there are some proposals from nonprofits like NDIA and Public Knowledge that say that there should be $4 to $5 million of that supports the Digital Equity Act, that supports grant making for states and local governments to provide their own kind of planning and programs as it relates to broadband services and digital literacy and training. So that's important in terms of that kind of funding. We also need some funding as it relates to the device vouchers. There are a number of folks who cannot afford to have a home computer, which we know is important in terms of accessing broadband services. Pew says that there are a number of folks, about 41% of low-income families do not have home devices. So hoping to see some of that money going to a device voucher. And lastly, I would say, we need funding and hope that a lot of that funding goes towards broadband deployment funds to ensure that there are build-out of infrastructure within underserved and unserved areas. That's very important if we're trying to connect a number of folks across the U.S.
So let me ask a broader question. I mean, there are the different types of digital divides, and you talked about at least two of them right there. How do we know if they've been solved? What's the objective? Or is this the kind of thing that actually never gets solved because of changing technology and so on?
Well, I'll go ahead and start and say that, first of all, just thank you so much for having me on the panel with this great panel. I know several of the panelists and have been on several different panels with them, both in my nonprofit as well as my for-profit days. And so I want to just thank Technology Policy Institute for having me represent the Urban League. You asked a general question early on, just how much money is it? Well, we know it's a bunch of billions. Yeah. And the good news, the bad news is it took a pandemic and the repercussions of a pandemic to get us here. The good news is we are here. And so what do we do? And Dominique talked about some things we absolutely have to look at. The devil is really going to be in the details. And I'm going to put my former state legislator hat on. If you look, and to answer this question, if you look at how we fix these divides, the devil is really going to be in the details. And so the money will be there, the billions will be there. What are we going to do with these billions? Will states participate? You asked, how do we know if we fix the divides? Well, we know there's an availability divide, a deployment divide, that some people still need access. And so there's billions of dollars that can be dedicated to closing that availability gap. We know there's an adoption gap. Some folks just, for whatever reason, it could be digital literacy, or it could be affordability, just have not adopted yet broadband at their homes. And what COVID showed was, especially in the African American community and minority communities, we were already lower on the spectrum, no pun intended, when it came to broadband in the homes. And we went to schools and we relied on it at libraries, or we may have even gone to an internet cafe to get it. Well, we couldn't even do that during a pandemic. And so what we saw is that the divide, even in the minority community, got larger and larger. So how will we ever know if we solve it, was your question. I think it's going to take time. It's going to take intentionality. The good news is we've got billions to do it. The bad news, or the news we should be worried about, is how we're going to work together to get it done. And that is what the Urban League and so many of the organizations are really concerned about, is the money's there, the intention's there, but are we really going to get it done?
I might add something along these lines, is that one thing that has not been mentioned a lot, but was mentioned in the Urban League report and in lots of other studies that have been looking at the impact on education, is that, for example, in Connecticut during COVID, they offered free computers, free internet service to the home, and yet they still couldn't get 100% adoption in those households who were eligible for everything to be done for free. So it suggests that some of the money that needs to be spent on adoption is not, so I agree, certainly making the cost lower and making sure that households have access to devices is important. But even that, even at a zero price, even with a free computer, we still see that adoption may not go to 100%, even in families who have children and really do need that access. And it could be for issues of migration, like families that migrate frequently, are migratory workers, so they're moving frequently, so it's difficult to keep setting things up. The parents may not be literate, may not be digitally literate. So there have been new programs trying to help people literally go to the home and help them set it up. And things like that. Basically what we would do for an elderly parent. Other households don't have that help. And I forgot what my second point was, but I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I just wanted to add really quickly there, and I think one of the issues around adoption in terms of the EBB program or Lifeline is that there is not a lot of funding for outreach and advertisement of the program. And so that's an issue, right? You need to have targeted information and messages around how people can sign up, the importance of the program, that it actually exists, because there is research that shows that many of these families don't know that it exists. And so if the FCC and other kind of federal programs don't have that kind of funding to do outreach and advertisement, then people can't take advantage of those kinds of programs.
So I think this has been a lot of great points that everyone's made. The National Urban League had a great study about what's going on. Dominique makes great points about the different digital divides. What Linda Cohen said this morning, and maybe it's because we share the same dissertation advisor, she said, throw money at the problem. I don't think, there's a lot of money here. And I don't think we should just throw money at the problem. I think we should try and figure out what works and what doesn't work. You just mentioned outreach. Well, we don't know what kind of outreach works. Let's try and figure it out. We have billions. We can spend $1 million doing an experiment. we can try and figure out what kinds of things work. So we don't just throw money at the problem. We can try and figure out what our goals are, and then try and figure out what's the best way to achieve those goals. People say, there are some people out there who are saying we need more money. Whatever the amount that was proposed, they say we need more. Well, maybe, maybe not. It depends what our goals are. But whatever money we have, let's use it to connect as many people as possible. Let's use it as efficiently as possible. If you can try and figure out ways to do that, then you're going to do a better job of spending this billions and billions, whatever Don said it was.
So,
Greg,
go ahead.
It's a great point. I just want to say, and there are organizations, to Greg's point and to all of your points, there are organizations that already exist in these communities that people trust. And you're right, Michelle. The government institutes programs all the time. And those of us who are more comfortable or in a different socioeconomic background, we always wonder, well, it's free. Why wouldn't everybody just want it? It just makes sense. Well, we don't know. We don't come from those people's backgrounds. Sometimes we don't understand what they may be living with, but there are organizations that do. Mm-hmm. And the organizations that do that work, the Urban League and so many others, as you said, Greg, let them have a shot with grants and outreach, as Dominique mentioned, outreach, and let's go out to the community and find out why people are having a hard time adopting, or is it affordability? To your point, and I agree with all of you, we need to be intentional about this thing. And you're right, we don't know if it's enough money or not yet. It's a compromise piece of legislation. There can always be better pieces, and I'm sure we're going to talk about what could be better and what are we hearing. But the good news is it's billions, and we've come a long way in a short time. Unfortunately, it's cost a lot of lives and a lot of jobs and a lot of small business owners their businesses. But this is an opportunity for us in America to redirect an industrial revolution that was already leaving millions and millions and millions of Americans behind. And so with this infrastructure bill, with these billions can give us an opportunity to do, in my opinion, is to right the ship a little bit, redirect our economy for small businesses, for mom and pop businesses, for young people who are going to school. I'm literally right now in a basement moving my daughter in to law school, and I'm using my little hotspot because we don't have broadband yet, even set up at our apartment. But this is the kind of technology and the opportunity that we have as a result of this, and we've got to get it right. I don't know that we can afford to get it wrong again.
So let's pick up on that theme a little bit, that maybe now is different, because we know, there's been universal service programs for a long time. We've spent, in real terms, probably close to $100 billion, most of it on availability, not on the lifeline issues. But the GAO writes reports all the time saying you need to do something to evaluate it, and it's just always ignored. But is now something different because, for one thing, we may have the money to do that, and also because it's not an issue that only a small number of people care about. It's sort of in everybody's consciousness now. Do you think that will make a difference in people really wanting to see programs that work? Or am I just naive? And
I think you're right that this is, 5 years ago we might have sat in this room and said, well, it's broadband is great, but not everybody needs it. You don't need it to go to school because nobody uses broadband. Or if you do, you can go on to a job board on dial-up access and upload your resume. But now things may be very different in terms of access to education and trying to do remote work and other things like that. And I think it is different now than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, I really think the pandemic highlighted the issues around access in terms of education, applying for jobs, also health, telemedicine, right? We realize how important it is to have a device and broadband connection to be able to connect to a doctor or, to receive healthcare services. So I think that's what makes this moment different, and, more people advocating for these issues before we have.
But one thing I think is important, especially when you were asking Scott earlier about when will we know we have succeeded, is we want to be careful not to say, oh, we won't have succeeded until there's 100% adoption in every household. Because what we're talking about here is fixed broadband access. And a lot of households have historically chosen mobile broadband access. That percentage has gone down significantly since COVID, since were needing, people were finding the need for kind of greater stability and greater speeds, but there may still be some households for whom mobile broadband access is sufficient. Also, there are some households who just don't care. So if you're 85 years old and you've never used a computer in your life, and you don't have a Facebook account, and you don't do TikTok, you may just not care to do it. So when we're looking at spending money and what is the value, we want to make sure that we're interested in making sure that households for whom fixed broadband access is relevant, that they are being connected and they are having the opportunity to be connected. Not just say 100% of the population must be connected, otherwise this is a failure.
Right, and I think it's worth pointing out, people do point it out, that even with landline telephones, we never got above, I think, 96%. So 100% is probably not.
But that's what Charlie was saying at lunch was, we don't have, he doesn't think everyone should be on fiber because the cost could be prohibitive to do that, and you might be able to use some of the money that you save by connecting people by fiber or by fixed wireless or by 5G in order to put that money more into affordability programs. Don's showing us how good a Wi-Fi access point or a hotspot can be. So maybe that's sort of an example, and if 5G gets better and doesn't have as many data limits, maybe that can be a good solution for a lot of people. So because there's a huge variety of how much people use of broadband and how much they need. People who go to work all day at a job away from their home may use a lot less broadband than people who work from home all the time. Or people who have 4 kids who are streaming different things may have a very different need for broadband than a single person. And so these are, these solutions shouldn't be one size fits all in this.
So actually, first, I forgot to remind people you can send in your questions on Slido. But so let's now, we talk in the abstract about what we should do, and it's easy to talk as if there are no budget constraints. And sometimes these days it seems like there aren't any budget constraints. But let's say however much money it is, let's say it's $100 billion. How do we allocate it? Where do you put the money first? Where does most of it go? Historically, we spent most money on build out in rural areas. And that still seems to be a lot of the discussion today, and maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. But I mean, if you have to allocate $100 billion, how do you do it? And of course, I'm sure we'll figure that all out right away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to focus on unserved and underserved areas. We need to focus on high-cost areas, which includes rural, sparsely, communities. And also, we need to really look into areas with above-average poverty rates. I think that's important because we know that affordability is an issue. And so in receiving those funds, I hope that state and local governments look at those communities that as I mentioned, are underserved or unserved in order to build out infrastructure, but also to create specific kinds of programs to ensure that those communities receive the broadband services first.
Well, but I mean, so you would first allocate money towards people who don't have broadband. You would focus more on the adoption than the availability problem at first. Sort of flip the way we've traditionally addressed it.
Absolutely. You want, I mean, to me, just of your terms of thinking about it sort of from a nationwide perspective, what you want to do is focus on who's not connected. And they're not connected for, 2 broad reasons we talk about. They don't have access and they can't afford it. Well, the people who can't afford it are a much, much bigger number than the people who don't have access. And especially if you can think that maybe, in 5 years, there are going to be other ways to provide access. So you'd want to really focus on affordability, in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And so we've actually, a couple of times people have mentioned the National Urban League's plan. So Dan, maybe you want to talk about it a little bit.
Sure, no, I'm glad, and thank you for mentioning it. So the Urban League, really, right when the pandemic was taking hold on the world, The Urban League sat down with our experts and the people that we work with and said, look, we really need to talk about this digital divide, because we saw that the digital divide was not only just its normal, typical divide, but because of the pandemic, because so many of our children were going to school for broadband access, because so many of our people who worked at home were going to work for broadband access. Now that they were at home and for whatever reason did not have access in the home, the divide widened. And so the Urban League authored a paper and worked with several of the experts in the field. It's called the LewisLatimer Project, or the LewisLatimer Plan, named after a very famous African-American inventor. And the plan really does, Scott, take a deep dive into many, many of the things we're talking about. So as you were sitting there and you asked the question, where could we spend $100 billion? The LewisLatimer program absolutely talks about all of the intricacies in the digital divide and all of the divides and the different things that we as a nation should be looking at, many of which we've talked about. Dominique in her opening really hit them. I mean, she talked about all of them: affordability, availability, adoption, literacy is a big one. So we've talked about all of those things. The good news is that most of the things that the Latimer Latimer Plan talks about were addressed. Most of the big things were addressed in the infrastructure proposal as it is written. Now, could there be more? Absolutely. Are there certain gaps there? There's certain things that I would love to see. Better engagement with HBCUs and the minority community, and absolutely. But does it address the major gaps, the major concerns? It does. And as we've said, we can continue to look at the divides. We can see if they're getting better. 100% may not be what we have. We should strive for perfection, but we may never get perfection. But we can do better. And so I would encourage anyone who wants more information about the LewisLatimer program, the project, to please go to our website and look at it. It's not something that dies now. I mean, just because an infrastructure bill, if one gets passed, there's still parts of the Latimer plan that we are going to continue to advocate for at the National Urban League, and hope that our partners will join us.
And can I reinforce something that I think Greg was mentioning? If we want to really focus on adoption, then as an economist, we want to think about, well, what is the most direct way to do that? And that is not through infrastructure plans, right? If we're looking at adoption, the point is there is access. So then it's a question of why the household isn't able to connect. And the most efficient way to do something there is actually to have a program that's at the household level, not trying to create incentives for overbuilding or inefficient entry on top of that. That would be incredibly expensive and have very little impact on the final result. So it's very important to think about what is the goal and what is therefore the most efficient way to approach the goal. And then when we're thinking about deployment, we can still worry about deployment, but if we're subsidizing deployment and infrastructure, it really needs to be in unserved areas, not in areas that are already having access and simply people aren't connecting. So that's a really important issue that I think a lot of the verbiage coming from Washington doesn't seem to make a distinction about.
So it's like, that's good that you flipped now to how do we spend this money, and Dominique, you mentioned this too at the beginning. So let's first talk about the adoption side. What do you all think of the emergency broadband benefit? Is that a good way of dealing with this problem, or are there other approaches that we should be trying?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great program for what it did in terms of providing extra funding for households to be connected to broadband services. As I mentioned earlier, I think that more funding could have been allocated for outreach and advertisement of it. We've seen some of the data in terms of how many people have signed up, and there could be more. But I think it's great in terms of a program and a step towards connecting more people. And I'm really hoping that that the funding that's within the infrastructure bill will continue that program, and we will end up somewhere with a permanent internet subsidy program.
And just a little plug, actually, on our broadband map, we have the EBB data. You can actually go out there and see where it's been spent and see what it correlates with if you're interested. Sorry.
Scott, I agree with Dr. Harrison. It's Don, I agree with Dr. Harrison. We supported the emergency broadband benefit at the National Urban League. In the LewisLatimer program, we called for a permanent broadband benefit. You know, the infrastructure bill calls for an affordable connectivity benefit. It says it's permanent. We'll see. I think it allocates 14 billion. Again, billions, not millions. So a lot of money. But I'm like Dominique. We were asking for a congressionally a mandatory congressional appropriation where we'd see that. So again, we're going to hold out hope that this is the right step and that Congress is right. And if not, we'll have to come back and advocate again. But we know it did help people afford broadband, especially during the emergency.
So one thing, Scott and I wrote a paper about Comcast's Internet Essentials program, where they charge $9.95 a month to families with children qualifying for free and reduced price lunch, and they've expanded it, so I don't know the details now. But that's a great program that, that doesn't, if they're willing to offer it, it doesn't need $50 a month. If somehow, so I love the idea of emergency broadband benefit, but I want to make sure that we can try and do it in as efficient a way as possible so that we could expand this to other low-income families that wouldn't necessarily qualify for this. Again, sort of my theme of spending the money as efficiently as possible, that we can get as much bang for the buck that we can, as many people connected as we can in this. So that's what I think about the emergency broadband benefit, was there's been some, make sure we do it in the right way rather than throw money at the problem.
So economists like to say that, generally, that we should use vouchers. I think mostly that's what economists say. Is EBB kind of close to voucher program? Close enough for you to be, to say this is the sort of thing that we...
I don't know enough of the details about it, what you're allowed to use it for and not use it for. So I don't, I'm not educated enough about what it is. I know they were offering $50 a month, but I don't know what you could buy with it. Because there's some, as I said, as Michelle said, this is something where somebody may care a lot about having fiber to their home, and somebody else may care about being able to have internet access all day long as they're moving around. So a true voucher would allow them to express those preferences.
Right. So let's talk about the availability side now. How should we distribute this money? Brian Sullivan just asked Charlie Ergen about RDOF, and he had some opinions. What's the right way to allocate money towards unserved areas? And also, how do we define unserved or underserved?
So maybe I'll jump in back in. I apologize I don't want to, I believe in competition, so you all should talk, not let me monopolize this. The RDOF auction had problems, as Charlie pointed out, with the definitions of the areas. That was not an auction problem. That was a mapping problem. And the mapping problem has to get solved. Mm-hmm. And that's key. But the fact that the FCC thought it was going to cost $16 billion to serve these areas, and it cost $9 billion, or roughly, this is a great example of government using the competitive process to make its dollars go further. And that's exactly what they should do, and exactly what they have eschewed in the broadband infrastructure plan. States, if they are being given grants to states should try and band together and do an RDOF auction type process and use the FCC software to run it if that's a problem. But having companies compete to drive down the cost to serve rural areas, to provide the accessibility, provides you with the ability to provide access in more areas. So that's how they should do it, but I'm just an economist, so they won't listen to me.
Right.
And you, Scott. I got to give Scott credit as well, because we talked about this in
That's true. They also won't listen to me.
Yeah, so unserved areas are areas where folks do not have any providers for broadband services, and so they cannot get connected. And I've seen definitions of underserved being areas that don't have 25.3 megabytes per second, which is the definition of high-speed broadband by the FCC. In thinking about earlier question that you mentioned, Scott, in terms of how do we know that we'll reach our goal, I mean, data, right, is very important to this conversation. We need to have reliable, accurate data to understand those areas that are unserved and underserved, of which we do not have right now. There have been many criticisms of the FCC data and TIA data and the questions and how they're asked. And so I think that's important, even as you mentioned the way states and local governments will spend that money. Some of that money should be spent towards research and really understanding the problem of their local constituents to be able to know the problem, set a goal, and achieve that goal, right? You don't know what you're solving for if you don't know the exact problem within your community.
Who should run this auction, or whatever mechanism we use? Who should be doing it? FCC, NTIA, someone else? Michelle?
I would argue for the FCC. They've got the experience, and I trust the mechanism that they do. Not to say that auctions are always set up perfectly, but I do think the FCC has a tremendous amount of experience and a willingness to experiment when they're trying new things. So I would recommend the FCC for that type of situation.
I'm really worried. As not being a moderator for a second, I'm worried about the delegation to the states. What's the effect of that? How will that affect things?
Depends on the state.
Sure.
Right, so we will get, I'm an advocate for running experiments on different things, and we're going to get experiments on the state level, but I think you're setting it up in a way that is doomed to spend a lot more money than you need to spend to do this stuff. And it's one of the things, if the FCC runs it as Michelle wants, which I don't necessarily disagree with, they have, a big key in what they do is assign weights to different technologies. And what these weights are critically important into who does bid and what their bids are in order to provide the service. So I think that's an important piece that probably won't get spelled out. But if you go to the states, they're going to go, well, we need fiber because no one's going to yell at us if we ask for fiber. And therefore you may get, I'm not using the term overbuilding the way you're using it, overbuilt, like too much capacity for the dollars that you spend. To unserved, I always use Ted Kaczynski's cabin in the middle of Montana. I'm not sure, well, some people argue we don't want internet access there at all, but just at least we want it by satellite or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with Greg there. I think there's also a regulatory capture problem. I've interacted with state utility, public utility commissions, and the amount of the ease with which those can be, not that the FCC can't have some regulatory capture as well, but it's much more difficult than at the state level to sway things, especially given that the people at the state level who would be working on these things might not have any background or experience really in the area.
I would imagine some of the people who wanted it to go to the states think that's a feature.
Yeah. And I guess, I don't know if she's here, I can't see anybody. Paroma was talking about California has a better
that's right.
system for figuring out where things are served right now than the FCC. Some states have better, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily should go to the states. They should help be an input to the process, in my mind. But the FCC should do a better job of where there is service and where there is not. I don't understand why the FCC doesn't have a database of all addresses and then say to broadband providers, you guys send bills to all, where you're providing service. Tell us all the addresses you're providing service. At least we would know where they're providing service for sure, and then where they could provide service, maybe we get them to say that. Maybe they don't, because they don't have 100% take up in their areas. But this is not, to me, rocket science, that the companies know if I call up my broadband service provider and say, I live at 123 Elm Street, they say, we can provide you service or we can't. And there's a way of figuring this out. And the companies know because they send somebody out to provide the service, they send a bill, that's a pretty good indication. And why this is not being done, and as Charlie said, make Comcast tell them where they provide service. That would be a great answer to try to get us to have the accurate systems that then we could try and figure out how to run this auction.
Dominique, you mentioned earlier when we were talking one of the things that you've focused on is the impact of the digital divide on Black residents in the Black rural South. That's an intersection of these of adoption and availability. Does that require a different kind of thinking, or is it enough to like say, okay, we have whatever we're going to have for adoption here, and we've got whatever we've got for availability here, and those will just intersect, and that's good enough? Or is this, is there something additional that needs to be done?
Well, first, at the Joint Center, we see this issue in terms of digital divide as an issue for Black Americans in both metropolitan and rural areas. But what we wanted to do is to focus on Black residents in rural America, because many times rural is conflated with white, and we don't focus on Black communities within those areas. And so what we found is that 38% of African Americans report not having access to broadband services, as indicated by the American Community Survey data. And so what we also found is that this is driven by lack of affordability and availability, right? So the infrastructure is not there based upon the available data that we do have. And also incomes of those community members are very low. 65% of those folks, or 61, excuse me, have incomes of $30,000 or less, right? That's a lot of people who live in poverty who then cannot afford these broadband services. So within a larger report to be released soon, we talk about these issues, and we talk about the opportunities, right, within education, employment, and health in terms of making those connections. But we also talk about the barriers, which includes, lack of competition in terms of options for service providers. We talk about prohibitive restrictions on states in terms of municipalities providing broadband services. And we talk about, speed and other kinds of issues. So I think there are a number of approaches to take, but I think, again, that we need to be intentional and specific about the challenges that specific communities face, and the kind of specific policies and programs that need to be developed to address those challenges. And we go into a little bit more detail in the report.
Paul Dessau at the FCC did an analysis of how much it would cost to connect almost everybody to fiber, and then how much to get to the rest of the people. And I forget what the numbers were. It was like 80 billion to get to everybody. I can't remember. Has that cost estimate ever been updated? Does anybody know? Or do we still use Paul's numbers for this?
So on my notes here, I have Paul's name. It says Paul Dessau estimates in my notes here as to how much would it cost to connect everybody. And that was my point was, Paul is a brilliant guy. And Paul worked really hard and talked to a lot of people. And I would bet 100% he was wrong. Just because there's no way he could be precisely right.
Also, he can't defend himself.
Well, no, I think Paul would agree that, you can't get it exactly right, but you can make an estimate, and he could be close. But you're right, it hasn't been updated, and technology has changed. But my argument, again, comes back to this. When we ran the RDOF auction, it was 60% of the cost they thought it was going to take to serve these areas. That's a pretty big difference. And I would bet that Paul's stuff, 5, 6 years, 7 years later, is going to be a different cost. And especially if you think about it as not just fiber, but you can do this mix of technologies depending upon the area, that you use fiber to get to places that cost under X, and between X and Y you use fixed wireless and that sort of thing.
There are other aspects that we haven't talked about, regulatory barriers to build out, or the flip side, parts of areas of regulation or other initiatives that can help encourage investment that's not just money. And Michelle, you in particular have worked on some of these barriers. And so tell us about that and what you think could be done.
Well, so I have oddly enough become like the pole attachment guru of the U.S., which was something I never sought to be. But one thing that's very important is that right now there are kind of distortions in the market for the provision of internet service. In particular, because of Section 224 of the Telecom Act, the municipalities and co-ops are exempted from pole rate attachment legislation or regulations. And in addition to that, there are kind of some advantages that municipalities have regulatory control over their areas, there's rights of way, and a lot of munis and co-ops in the areas that they are, their footprint, they have a majority of existing poles. And in a lot of the locations, there are regulations preventing the establishment of a second set of poles. So the consequence of this kind of historical background is that nationally, on average, munis and co-ops charge about twice or more per pole attachment than a regular utility pole owned by investor-owned utility or telephone company. So there's already kind of this distortion there. And so I've done 2 studies looking at the impact of this. One is a more recent study, and this is, so some of my results are a little bit preliminary. It's with a student named TJ Zhu. And we looked at Illinois at the census block level from June 2016 to June 2018. So looking at over 300,000 census blocks. And we looked at where muni ISPs were providing service and co-op ISPs were providing service. We looked at everything from like the type of technology, the number of incumbents, population densities, income, all these things. And what we find is that the presence of a muni ISP or the presence of a co-op ISP has a tremendously negative effect on the probability of further entry during that period. So specifically, in all the census blocks, we find that an incumbent positively the presence of an incumbent ISP increases the probability of entry by further ISPs. However, if that incumbent is a muni ISP, then that lowers the probability of entry by 78% relative to a regular incumbent. And if that incumbent is a co-op ISP, that lowers the probability by 87% relative to a regular incumbent. So net, the muni and co-op ISPs are discouraging entry by other ISPs. So when we're thinking about should we, people have said, well, we should be favoring muni ISPs or government ISPs, and these data suggest that they are actually creating a negative competitive situation, which is discouraging others from entering. And I would argue that a large part of that, it has to do with pole attachment costs. The second thing, and I've done another study, this was part of a consulting job in Georgia in front of their public utility, their commission. And there I had data on the actual pole attachment rates. And what I showed them using actually Georgia data on deployment, because it was better than the FCC data. They had Georgia data that looked at the percentage of locations within a census block that were unserved. So you had actual measures of whether, had 10% of locations were served or 90% were served. And in there, I calculated the average pole attachment cost per county, brought that down to the census block level, including controls for income, density, et cetera, age, et cetera, and found that basically a 10% increase in average pole attachment costs per capita ended up increasing the percent of unserved locations in a census block by 50 percentage points. So that was a huge impact, helped by the fact that Georgia had created this lovely data set, which of course the commissioners immediately ignored entirely my results. In fact, almost refused to hear them because they had already decided that they did not want to impose controls on the munis or the co-ops for their pole attachment rates. The second thing that I found with my student was that not only was the presence of muni and a muni ISP or co-op ISP a deterrent for further entry, controlling for all other factors, even geography for the census blocks, but if we then looked at the highest quality available in a census block, and we measured the highest speed offered within a census block, regardless of who's offering it, we found that the presence of a Muni ISP and a co-op ISP led to lower quality within the census blocks, all else equal. So controlling for income, controlling for other things, the presence of these types of ISPs actually led to lower quality outcomes in those areas. So I think it's very important that we make sure that at a minimum, any of this new infrastructure spending is not further exacerbating a distortion in favor of governmental ISPs against private ISPs. At a minimum, we don't want to increase that distortion. I would actually argue we'd like to remove the distortion as much as possible by having similar regulation for Muni and co-op pole owners as for everyone else in the United States.
So these papers you dealt with endogeneity issues and things like that, sort of the obvious. Maybe those are just in places where it's already not good.
Right, but so one thing is we're looking at continued entry, right? So we're starting at this base point. We're controlling for the conditions of the location, and we're looking at new entry. So we're looking at changes. And so we're seeing that pattern based on the incumbency, adjacency threat, what type of incumbents there are, as well as kind of the market factors. And we're using fixed effects for the markets themselves to control for geography and things like that. So there could be some other potential endogeneity issues, but we're looking at this, and we're looking based on the market factors prior to entry.
Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to take this into an academic discussion. But so let's move back to the other part of the policy side that we haven't talked about, which is how do you pay for any of these initiatives, right? I mean, we have for the infrastructure plan, it's allocated, or hopefully it'll be allocated, appropriated. I'm sorry. But how do we pay for universal service generally? I mean, we know that the standard, the way we've been doing it for years, taxing long distance service, whatever that is, and mobile just isn't going to cut it. And right now there's a plan to tax big tech because it's always big tech's a good target for everybody right now. But is that a good idea? And if not, how do we fund these programs?
Scott, I'll just say I think we have to make it a priority in our country, and I think our Congress has to appropriate the funds. If we start playing winners and losers, which is what we've kind of done, our chosen people, we see what happens, and even if it works for a short time, it's not sustainable. And so I think it just has to be one of those things that our government helps us with, and that we make it a priority and we find money to do it. Because as I said at the very beginning, this is bigger than just a TikTok access. This is an industrial, I'm calling it industrial, but it's a revolution. It's one of the first revolution in our country that all Americans have access to. We didn't have access to the agricultural revolution if you were a person of color because you were enslaved. Didn't have access during the industrial revolution if you were a person of color because of Jim Crow and discrimination. Here we have an opportunity, and we were about to miss another revolution in our country. But this is a revolution where we have an opportunity that all Americans can, if they have access, can someday achieve the American dream. And so this just has to be one of those things government is serious about. It's a priority. It shouldn't be partisan. It should just be one of those things that we make it a priority. And that way we don't have to pick winners and losers or what company's turn it is this time to pay for this. And when their lobbyists and their interests are they're not able to do it, then somebody loses. And it's the little person who loses. And so let's just make it a priority. And the men and women we elect to go to Congress and the men and women we elect to be our leaders, make it a priority and fund this and get it right.
So, I mean, as an economist, I'd love to hear that. We want to see things funded through general appropriations, but that suggests you're pretty optimistic that people think it's a priority now, but that they still will 5 years from now.
I mean, I think I want to just follow up on what you said, which is, from the economist perspective, one of my other fields in addition to competition policy was public finance. And having as broad-based a tax as you can is the most efficient way to raise a certain amount of money. It's also a way to kind of put it into the budget if you can fix it. It's just like we don't tax food to pay for food stamps.
Right.
Why do we tax telecom services to pay for low-income broadband programs? It just doesn't make sense. It's a much more efficient system and much fairer that everybody, it's on a more progressive income tax that we pay for these things. And I think that's a much better way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely add, I'm not an expert in this area, but just saying that there is a role for private industry and big tech. I mean, there are a lot of profits that are made, as we spoke about earlier in our earlier panel today, by these platforms and tech companies. So I think that we should be intentional about looking into how they can help in solving the problem. Without broadband services, people can't access those platforms. And so how can they be a part of solving for this problem?
I think we're just about out of time. If anybody would want to make some last closing remarks before we head off and go hiking. I don't know what you guys are going to do wherever you are, but...
I would just lastly say that I think the issue of digital redlining is an important topic, and I'm glad to see that there is some focus on that issue. We know that digital redlining is occurring in a lot of large cities and is occurring in rural areas. And so I'm excited about the proposal by Yvette Clark, Representative Yvette Clark, in terms of her legislation around preventing digital redlining. And I'm also happy to see that language within the infrastructure bill to ensure that the FCC develops rules to prevent this, but also creates more information on best practices and policies for states to ensure that if any ISP comes in and wants to provide services, that they have to provide it for the entire community, and it is not based on income and or race. So that's one thing I'm happy to see about.
Oh, yeah, want to go?
Right?
I'll jump with one last thing, which is we talked a little bit about, very little bit about digital literacy.
Yeah.
And I think that can be an extremely important thing, but I don't know what digital literacy training is. There are probably, it's American Pie. It's great. Everybody loves it. But what it is, I'm not sure. And we have huge amount of money. Let's run some experiments and see what works in different communities for different groups of people. How do we kind of do training that makes sense for people to get them to understand what's going on, and then try and do digital literacy training in an efficient way.
Yeah, I agree with
I
that.
just want to thank you for the time. Greg, I'll say we explain what digital literacy is in the Lewis-Latimer plan, and so happy. Please take a look at it. We'd love to work with you and anyone watching on what that is and how we can make that a reality for the country.
Okay.
Thank you for your attention today.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate you participating.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
And we will reconvene at 6:30 for a reception outside, upstairs in the courtyard, and then at 7, the working groups. It does?